The heat shimmered across the Texas prairie, waves rising off the dust like ghosts of some forgotten past. A dozen Japanese women stood motionless outside a low-slung ranch house, their uniforms ragged, their faces stiff with sunburn and suspicion. They had arrived expecting a prison, barbed wire, barking guards, cruel labor. Instead, they were met by something surreal. 3 American men in broad-brimmed cowboy hats, sleeves rolled, boots caked with dirt, carrying plates of steaming peach pie. The older cowboy tipped his hat. "Fresh out of the oven," he said. One woman flinched. Another stared at the crusted topping like it was a trap. The youngest among them, barely 20, reached out, trembling. She hadn't tasted fruit in years. The pie was still warm. That single bite exploded with sweetness and confusion. And in that moment, everything they had been told about the enemy began to crumble. Because this wasn't just food, this was dignity, disguised in cinnamon and butter. The train had lurched to a stop hours earlier, but the women still felt its rhythm in their bones, like some phantom motion pulsing beneath their feet. A dry wind scraped across the platform at the edge of a dusty Texas rail line, carrying scents they did not recognize: mesquite, cattle, sun-baked soil. And the women stood stiffly in the heat, squinting against the glare. They had been told nothing about where they were going, only that they had lost the war, and that they were now property of the enemy. Property. That was the word their officers used. Better to die than be taken, their commanders had warned them back in Japan. The Americans will shame you, starve you, treat you like animals. But the war had ended, the empire had bowed, and now they stood in a country none of them had ever seen before, a place that looked more like a postcard than a battlefield. They were a strange group, clerks who once typed logistics reports for the Navy, nurses who had bandaged shrapnel wounds in jungle hospitals, radio operators who listened to silence through the war's final months. All of them had worn uniforms. All had taken oaths. And all of them now bore the same haunted expression, the look of women who had been prepared to die and were now punished by the fact that they had not. Capture, they had been told, was not just dishonorable, it was dehumanizing. And yet, as the American soldiers moved among them, counting heads and calling out names in accents thick with Texas drawl, there was no sneering, no spitting, just a quiet efficiency that made the silence even more unbearable. They were loaded onto buses with leather seats and dusty windows. One woman whispered that the seats were too soft, a trick, perhaps, to make them lower their guard. Outside the windows, the landscape began to change. Rolling hills gave way to flatness so vast it seemed to swallow the sky. Miles and miles of nothing, no ruined buildings, no bomb craters, just land stretching into the blue, broken only by the occasional windmill or lonely tree. It was a kind of wilderness they could not understand. One of the women pressed her face to the glass, watching a herd of cattle amble across a field. She turned and said nothing, but her eyes were wide with disbelief. This did not look like the country of monsters. It looked like a place that had never known war. The heat grew thicker as the bus rolled deeper into Texas. Sweat gathered behind knees and under collars, but no one spoke. The driver chewed something that looked like grass and kept humming a tune under his breath. It was not until the late afternoon that they saw it. The facility, if it could even be called that. It was not a fortress. There were no searchlights, no towers with machine guns. Instead, it looked like a cattle ranch. A few long wooden buildings stood beneath the sky, flanked by grazing fields and a wind pump spinning slowly in the breeze. The perimeter was lined not with barbed wire, but with split-rail fences barely waist-high. The women blinked, certain they had missed something. Where were the floodlights? The barking dogs? They were told to disembark. A soldier, not more than 25, pointed toward the main house and said, "Y'all can rest inside. Supper's comin'." The words meant little, but his tone was gentle. One woman instinctively flinched as he walked past, but he did not even look at her. Another guard, leaning against a fence post, tipped his hat. This wasn't how enemies acted. It wasn't how guards acted either. The women stood there, paralyzed by confusion. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in streaks of orange and pink. In the distance, a cow mooed lazily. And then, faintly, the sound of something baking, pastry, maybe, or bread, drifted from the kitchen. That night, as they lay on clean mattresses in a barracks that smelled of cedar, the women whispered to one another in the dark. One muttered that the Americans were setting a trap. Another said nothing, staring up at the rafters, remembering the ruins of Tokyo. But the youngest among them, the one who had once recited death oaths with clenched fists, clutched a pillow to her chest and asked quietly, "If this is captivity, what was freedom?" No one answered her. Not yet. Outside, under a sky crowded with stars, a guard leaned against the porch and strummed a guitar. The melody was foreign, but the silence that followed felt like peace. And in that silence, the war they had carried inside began, just barely, to unravel. That question grew heavier with each passing day, even as the women began to move through the camp with less stiffness in their limbs. The ranch, if one could even call it that, did not behave like any prison they had imagined. There were no locked gates, no spotlights sweeping over their bunks, no snarling dogs patrolling the perimeters, just fences that could be stepped over, wide skies, and the occasional sound of a horse trotting past the barracks. It unsettled them in ways they could not explain, because freedom, when not taken but given freely, felt more dangerous than captivity ever had. Each morning began with the clang of a bell tied to the porch of the main house. It wasn't shouted orders that pulled them from sleep, but the smell of coffee and biscuits wafting in from the mess hall. They lined up in silence, still cautious, still not ready to meet the eyes of the men who cooked their food or poured their drinks. The kitchen staff, most of them older men in worn jeans and dust-covered boots, didn't bark commands. They didn't even seem to notice the fear etched into the prisoners' faces. One man, a tall Texan with sun-scorched skin, even made a small joke one morning as he handed out plates. "Don't worry, we ain't poisoning the pie," he said, and chuckled to himself as if the comment were perfectly ordinary. None of the women laughed, but one of them, without meaning to, smiled. It was not what they had trained for. These Americans didn't leer or gloat. They didn't act like conquerors. Most of the guards seemed more like ranch hands than soldiers, their uniforms faded, their hats tilted back, their movements slow and unhurried. They fixed fences, shoveled feed, swatted flies from their faces. In fact, many of them barely looked at the women unless duty required it. One prisoner, who had served as a nurse in the Pacific, whispered to another, "They treat us like we're part of the landscape." And it was true. The most disarming thing about their captors was how little hatred they seemed to carry, but that calm only deepened the unease. If the Americans weren't cruel, then what was their angle? One woman, a former code clerk from Kyoto, became convinced that the ease was a calculated trap, a slow psychological dismantling of their spirit. "They want us to forget who we are," she said bitterly, turning her untouched slice of cornbread upside down on her tray. Others nodded. Even kindness in excess can begin to feel like control. There were still small, defiant acts. Some women ate only half their meals, hiding food in their bunks as if the rations might suddenly stop. Others refused to bathe more than once a week, clinging to grime as if it were proof of loyalty. When given clean socks, one woman tore hers down the seam and stitched them back poorly, claiming the gift had made her uncomfortable. These were not rebellions against mistreatment. They were protests against being treated too well. And yet, slowly, that resistance began to falter under the weight of routine. The mattresses stayed soft, the meals remained warm. No punishments came for stepping out of line. There were chores, sweeping porches, weeding garden beds, helping in the laundry, but they were light, and no guard barked if the work was slow. A strange rhythm began to settle in. Wake, eat, work, rest. It did not feel like freedom. But it also did not feel like punishment. One afternoon, a group of prisoners watched as two guards attempted to wrangle a loose calf that had broken through the fence. The animal darted through the yard, kicking up dust, as one of the cowboys cursed under his breath and the other tripped into a barrel of feed. The women stared, unsure whether to laugh or turn away. And then one of them, the youngest, couldn't help it. She laughed. Not loudly, not cruelly, just a single quiet sound that surprised even her. The guard who had fallen into the barrel looked up, covered in oats, and grinned. The moment passed quickly, but in that instant the fence between captor and captive cracked, not from violence, but from absurdity. That night, the women lay on their bunks, staring at the wooden ceiling beams. Outside, the insects sang, and somewhere, a harmonica played a tune none of them recognized. The world beyond the camp remained a mystery. But inside these fences, the war no longer made sense, not in the way it used to, and that, perhaps, was the cruelest kindness of all. It came the next morning, the act so small it should have passed without notice. But it didn't, because kindness, when wrapped in sugar and served warm, can hit harder than any weapon. The bell rang at dawn, and the women stepped into the sun-soaked yard with the same cautious rhythm they had learned over the past week. A cowboy leaned against the kitchen doorway, arms folded across his chest, chewing something like tobacco and nodding toward the tables behind him. "Breakfast," he said, "and pie, fresh out of the oven." The words didn't land at first. Pie? As in dessert? Some of the women paused, unsure if they had misunderstood, but then they saw it. Rows of plates, each with a slice of golden peach pie glistening in the light, steam still rising from the soft crust, sugar caramelized just slightly along the edges. The smell hit them next. Butter, fruit, cinnamon. For a moment the air itself felt foreign, like stepping into someone else's memory. The first woman to reach the table stared at her plate without sitting. Her hands twitched at her sides. She had served in Burma, patched together wounded men in the jungle, and once boiled shoe leather for broth. Now she stood in the middle of a sunlit ranch, being handed pie by the enemy. Her lips parted, but no sound came. A second woman, younger, picked up her plate and carried it to the edge of the yard, where she sat on the grass and did not eat. Another simply stared, then slowly slid her piece beneath the folds of her coat when no one was looking. Only one, the same one who had laughed at the calf the day before, dared to take a bite. She didn't mean to. Her stomach made the choice for her. The moment the crust touched her tongue, her eyes blinked wide, and then the tears came. Not loud, not theatrical, just a quiet surrender, sugar and salt meeting on her skin. Around her no one spoke. The pie was a silence louder than any speech. They had been trained to expect bullets, starvation, shame. But this was worse, because it was kind, because it offered comfort without demand, and because it reminded them, brutally, inescapably, of a world where sweetness had once been normal. a world they had not tasted in years. That moment, the taste of pie on a prisoner's tongue, made history feel personal again. Have you ever heard of Japanese women held in American POW camps? Let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you want more stories like this, go ahead and like the video, hit the subscribe button, it's right below the video, and click the notification bell so you never miss one of these forgotten chapters of history. Your support helps us keep these stories alive. By nightfall, the pie had vanished. Some had eaten, others had not, but none had forgotten it. That evening, the sky turned the color of cooling ash, and the guards built a small fire near the edge of the corral. No one was ordered to gather, but some women drifted closer, drawn by the warmth. They sat in silence, not as soldiers, not as prisoners, but as something else. Beneath the stars, a harmonica whispered a tune that no one recognized. One woman, the one who had hidden her pie, sat with her arms wrapped around her knees, eyes fixed on the fire. She did not speak, but in her coat pocket the slice had crumbled. She could feel it against her leg, sticky and soft, a ghost of something she could not name. That night, more than one of them cried, but not from fear, not from pain, from something far stranger. They had been treated gently, and that was harder to bear. The next day, the ranch buzzed with the smell of laundry soap and the low thud of wooden crates being unloaded near the main house. A corporal with sleeves rolled high called out names as each woman stepped forward to receive her parcel. A folded uniform, a pair of worn but clean shoes, and something none of them expected, a thick bar of soap wrapped in brown paper. The package weighed more than it looked, dense and fragrant, a faint scent of lavender or maybe something citrusy curling up from the creases. They stared down at it in their palms as though it might vanish. Soap. Real soap. Not the gritty powder they had once shared by the spoonful in bombed-out bathhouses. Not the lie they had been warned would sting the skin. This was smooth, solid, soft at the corners. The kind of soap a mother might have placed in a drawer to make the linens smell clean. The kind that belonged to civilians, not prisoners. They were told the showers were behind the barracks, housed in a small wooden stall with swinging doors. The women approached it slowly, like a trap. In some camps, they had heard, showers weren't showers at all. But here, there was no barbed wire, no shouting, no guards with batons, just the creak of boards underfoot and the sound of running water. One woman stepped inside and locked the door. The knob clicked gently into place, as if privacy itself had been rationed for her alone. What followed was not dramatic. No speeches, no tears, just steam and silence and skin, layers of dust, sweat, and memory slipping away beneath warm water. The soap lathered thick, buttery on the skin. It smelled like nothing they had touched since the war began. One woman rubbed it down her arms and wept quietly, not because it hurt, but because it didn't. She had forgotten what warmth could feel like without punishment attached. For women raised in the shadow of Bushido, this created a rupture. They had been taught that suffering was proof of loyalty, that comfort was indulgence, and indulgence was shame. To bathe like this, alone and unharmed, was to challenge that foundation. One woman, a radio technician from Nagoya, refused to go in for 3 days. She clutched her soap like a weapon, unwrapped but unused. "I will not wash for their amusement," she said. Another nodded but still went in the next evening, trembling as she stepped into the light. The camp never commented. No one mocked the hesitation. No guard pushed them forward. It was as if the very lack of cruelty became its own kind of burden, and slowly, one by one, they relented. On the 5th morning, a woman began to hum in the shower. It started as a breath, half melody, half memory. Then it grew. Not loud, just soft enough to catch the edges of the wind. A lullaby, maybe, something from childhood. The other women paused, towels in hand, unsure if they should hush her. But no one did. The humming continued. And then, for a moment, someone laughed. It was quiet, gentle, the kind of laugh that spills out when sorrow finally takes a breath. It wasn't rebellion. It wasn't defeat. It was something else entirely, a reclaiming of self. That afternoon, as uniforms flapped on the clotheslines and soap bars lined the window sills to dry, the women moved more slowly, less out of fear, more out of thought. The texture of their skin had changed. Their hair hung loose now, damp and soft. For the first time in weeks, perhaps months, they could smell themselves without flinching. Cleanliness had become something sacred, not a gift, not a weapon, but a quiet, undeniable reminder that they were still people, that their bodies still mattered. And that, too, was its own kind of revolution. The next offering came not in the form of pie or soap, but in paper, blank, white, uncreased. The guards passed out thin notepads one afternoon, along with dull pencils that smelled faintly of cedar. No explanation. Just a nod, a gesture, and a simple phrase from one of the men in uniform. "Write home." The words struck the women like a slap. Not because they were cruel, but because they were impossible. The barracks fell into a hush. Some stared at the paper as if it might vanish. Others clutched it close, too afraid to begin. One woman whispered, "They will never send them." Another shook her head, "They will burn them." The rules of war, the rules they had been taught, did not include this. The enemy did not let you write home. And if they did, it meant they were watching every word. Censorship, manipulation, betrayal. The letters would be twisted, or worse, used as traps. Still, the page sat there, empty, waiting. That night, under the flickering lantern light, the young nurse who had cried over her first shower finally sat down at her bunk and picked up the pencil. Her hand trembled as she wrote the first word. "Mother." The pencil scratched softly against the paper, dragging hesitation behind it. She paused, glancing toward the door. No one was watching. No one had stopped her. She continued, "I am alive." It felt strange to write it, stranger than bathing, stranger than the pie. That simple declaration felt like a betrayal to the friends who had died, to the officers who had told her death was preferable to surrender. She hesitated again. "They give us pie." She nearly erased it, but something stopped her. No metaphor, no explanation. Just the truth. The enemy had given them pie. That was the unbearable fact. Her fingers moved faster after that, the page filling with small confessions, clean sheets, soft blankets, hot water, a guard who spoke with a gentle voice, a slice of peach that made her weep. She did not write everything. She could not, and yet, even with the omissions, the words felt dangerous. The next morning, more women joined her. Pencils hovered, the rustling of pages echoed through the barracks. Some folded their letters neatly. Others stared at half-finished sentences for hours. A few tore their pages up after writing, unable to bear the risk. But the act itself, of writing, of remembering, of addressing someone who might never read the words, cracked something open. One woman wrote about her brother still fighting, perhaps already dead. Another described the wind on the Texas plains, how it smelled of grass and dust, not of fire and ash. One simply wrote, "I don't know who I am anymore." The act of writing was not freedom. It was not even forgiveness. but it was the first time many of them had put their thoughts into language since the surrender, and with every sentence, the stories they had been fed about cruelty, about torture, about humiliation, began to feel less like truth and more like shadows. Doubt crept in, slow but sure. If the enemy allowed them to write, what else had been a lie? Of course, they still wondered if the letters would be sent. Most assumed they would be intercepted. A few were sure they would be edited before reaching home, if they reached home at all. But the paper didn't ask for certainty, only honesty, and for many of the women, that was the first thing they had been allowed to offer in years. When the guards collected the envelopes, there were no threats, no warnings, just nods, quiet as always. One guard even tapped a finger to his chest and said, "I had a sister. I hope she's safe, too." The words hung in the air, awkward and sincere. That evening, the nurse sat at the edge of the porch, her letter folded in her lap, waiting to be taken. She didn't know if her mother was alive. She didn't know if her words would ever reach Japan. But for the first time since her capture, she felt something crack open inside her. Not pain, not grief, but the fragile possibility of being understood. And sometimes understanding is the first form of freedom, even if it never arrives. That evening, as the sun bled out across the Texas plain in streaks of amber and rust, the nurse found herself walking slower than usual after dinner, lingering near the fence that wrapped the far paddock. A horse stood there, tall, muscled, flecked with dust and flies, its hide a smooth patchwork of brown and white. She had never touched a horse before, not in Japan, not during training. In the Empire, they had been symbols of old wars, paraded in ceremonies, not fed by the hands of ordinary women. From the corner of her eye, she saw him. The cowboy. Buck, they called him. Though whether that was his real name or just the one the women had given him, no one knew. He was the kind who chewed quietly, eyes squinted beneath a weather-worn hat, his belt worn at the edges from years of sun and use. He approached without speaking, holding out a handful of oats in his palm. Then, slowly, he gestured to her, not demanding, not commanding, just offering. She hesitated. Then, step by step, she crossed the short grass between them and took a single oat from his hand. He smiled, the lines in his face creasing gently, and handed her the rest. The horse lowered its head, and she held out her palm. Its mouth was warm and wet and strange against her skin. It didn't flinch, neither did she. Buck nodded once, then handed her the rope reins. She didn't understand what he said. Something soft, probably Texan. But it didn't matter. She got the meaning. "Hold steady, don't be afraid." And so she did. They walked together in silence, the sun dropping lower, casting long shadows that stretched like ribbons across the pasture. No commands, no translators. Just gestures and dust and the shared rhythm of steps. That night, after the guards had settled and the fire was lit near the porch, Buck took a seat on a wooden stool and pulled something small and shiny from his coat pocket. The women gathered at a distance, some sitting cross-legged, others standing with arms folded, unsure if they were allowed to listen. He brought the harmonica to his lips and played. It wasn't a song they knew, not one from their childhoods or the radio broadcasts they'd clung to back in Japan. It was a wandering tune, full of bends and pauses, slow like molasses and filled with something like longing. The notes drifted over the dirt and into the trees, carried by the hush of the wind and the creak of wooden beams. The women listened without speaking. One of them closed her eyes. Another hummed softly, out of sync but still following. It wasn't the kind of music that demanded applause. It simply existed, like the sun or the pie or the unexpected softness of clean sheets. When he finished, Buck looked up. No one clapped. But no one walked away either. He gave a little nod, tipped his hat, and stood. The nurse didn't say thank you. She couldn't. But she held the moment in her chest like a warm stone, something weightless and impossible to explain. The next morning, the horse, the one with the quiet eyes, stood near the fence again. Someone had painted a nameplate above the stall the night before, one of the guards, probably. The letters were crooked, but clear. It read, Mercy. The women didn't ask who named her. They didn't need to, because that horse, that music, that evening under the firelight, none of it belonged to the war. It belonged to something else, something human, something alive, something neither country had taught them to expect. The next offering came not on a plate or in a gesture, but bound in pages. A book, worn at the corners, its cover soft from years of handling. It was placed gently in the young nurse's lap one morning as she sat beneath the awning of the barracks, staring out toward the horse paddock. Buck didn't say a word. He just set it down and walked away, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust. She picked it up slowly. The title meant nothing to her. The letters all looked the same. Foreign, crooked, but when she opened it, color spilled out. Illustrations danced across the pages, a girl standing beneath a tree, a boy with a kite, a mother kneeling in a garden. On one page, a sun was drawn high in a blue sky. On another, the word home floated above a painted house with white steps and a red door. She stared at that word, home. She didn't know how to say it, but somehow she understood. Later that day, one of the guards, not Buck, but a younger man with soft eyes and a notebook tucked into his waistband, invited them to the mess hall. There, lined along the back wall, were more books, a chalkboard, a single table with pencils and a mug. He didn't force them to come closer. He just smiled and said slowly, English, if you want to learn. Most of the women turned away. To study the enemy's language felt like surrender. Words, after all, were not just communication. They were culture, identity, power. To say apple in their tongue was harmless, but to say it in English felt like a betrayal. One woman scoffed under her breath and walked out. Another lingered at the doorway, then followed, but the nurse stayed. The book was still in her hands. The guard pointed to the cover and said slowly, Book. She didn't answer. He said it again, tapping once. Book. She nodded, not because she accepted it, but because she understood the challenge. That evening she returned to the mess hall. She came alone. The young guard was there, erasing something from the chalkboard. He looked surprised, then pleased. He picked up a piece of chalk and wrote, Sun. He pointed outside, toward the fading orange sky. Sun, he said again. The nurse looked, then nodded. They continued in silence for 20 minutes. Tree, hand, home, apple. The words clumsy in her mouth, but not rejected. They weren't orders. They were offerings. Soon, other women began to watch from the doorway. They didn't enter, but they watched. One muttered that the guards were trying to erase them. Another whispered that perhaps the guards wanted them to understand instead, because here's what none of them expected. The Americans didn't teach them to say surrender or enemy. They taught them cloud, sleep, bread, words not of power, but of living. One afternoon, the nurse wrote the word mother in her notebook. The letters shook, but she didn't erase them. The shame didn't vanish, but the fear that understanding meant forgetting began to fade. For the first time, she wondered, what if learning the enemy's words didn't mean losing herself? but finding something new. Language, she realized, wasn't just a weapon, it was a bridge, and the ones building it didn't raise it with force, but with patience, books, and the simple trust that someone on the other side might be willing to meet them halfway. The next day, the world ended. It didn't come with sirens or fire, not here. It came folded in a telegram, passed from hand to hand, until a guard with solemn eyes and slow steps posted it beside the mess hall door. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The headline said enough. Hiroshima destroyed. Bomb unlike any other. Thousands dead. The women read it in silence. Then came another. Nagasaki. Another city gone. Then the final notice. Japan has surrendered. The war is over. They did not cry right away. At first there was only stillness, like breath held too long. Then the movement began. One woman collapsed to her knees. Another ripped the sleeve from her uniform with shaking hands. Someone whispered a prayer that turned into a scream. A third woman walked out to the far field, buried her face in the soil, and did not move for a long time. The young nurse stood beneath a tree near the paddock. She did not speak. Her letter home, the one that said she was alive, that she had been given pie, now felt like something obscene. They had believed in something, not just in an emperor, but in a structure, a story that gave meaning to the pain, the obedience, the silence. That story said they would win through sacrifice, that honor was eternal, that the enemy would be monstrous, and that death was better than the shame of capture. And now the empire had knelt. Their gods had been silenced, their families, their cities, their lives, all reduced to ash under a sky they would never see. What did it mean to have survived? The myth had cracked weeks ago when soap and blankets were handed to them instead of chains. It fractured again with pie, with music, with words like home and son. But this was collapse. Not slow, not gentle, sudden, final, absolute. One woman tore the flag patch from her jacket and let the threads hang loose. Another stared at her hands, as if unsure who they belonged to now. The silence that followed was not peace. It was disorientation, a falling from great height into something without shape. The nurse sat down beside the horse stall, her legs folding without command. Mercy, the horse, nudged at her sleeve, searching for oats. She had none to give. Only the weight in her chest, the knowledge that she had lived while others had burned. And that was the cruelest irony of all. Here in the enemy's land they were safe, fed, taught, washed. And back in Japan their mothers boiled weeds for broth. Their siblings dug graves with bare hands. Their cities choked on smoke. There was no honor in that imbalance, only a gnawing guilt that made food taste bitter and blankets feel too warm. Some women asked if they would be sent home soon. Others didn't want to ask. The idea of returning to a homeland that no longer existed, to families that might be gone, felt more terrifying than staying behind barbed wire. At least here the sun still rose without fear. At least here their names were still spoken by people who had no reason to be kind. That evening no one played the harmonica. No books were opened. The mess hall was quiet, save for the sound of spoons scraping empty plates. Not from hunger, but from habit. And as night settled across the ranch, the nurse lay awake and whispered to no one, "We were supposed to die for them. But they hadn't. They had lived. And now they had to carry that truth. Through the silence, through the shame, through whatever came next, winter softened into spring. Grass grew long at the edges of the fence. The horses shed their coats. The days came and went in a rhythm so steady that it stopped feeling like survival and started to feel like something else. Not quite freedom, not quite captivity, just life. The women fell into quiet routines. They swept porches, folded laundry, fed the chickens. Some even joked again, cautiously, as if testing the weight of their own voices. The nurse still helped in the kitchen, her movements practiced, precise. She learned how to say spoon and butter in English, and the cook, a wiry man named Earl, learned to say good in Japanese, nodding after each meal. But nothing truly prepared them for the list. It appeared one morning, nailed to the side of the mess hall like a poster from another world. Typed neatly, in both English and Japanese, a list of names, those chosen for repatriation. Going home. The phrase hit like an earthquake. Women rushed to read it, breath caught in their throats. Some found their names near the top and burst into tears, hands trembling as they backed away from the wall. Others scanned the list twice, then 3 times, before realizing they had been left behind. For now. The nurse's name was there, 4th from the bottom. She didn't know how to feel. It had been months since she last pictured Japan as a real place. Her letters had gone unanswered. The only image she had of home now was the one in her memory. But even that was blurred by ash, silence, and grief. Who would be there to meet her? Would anyone? And who was she now, anyway? She'd been a soldier, a prisoner, a student, a stranger. What title would she carry back across the ocean? That night, the guards held a small gathering around the fire. There was no ceremony, no flags, no salutes, just a quiet circle under the stars, coffee poured into chipped mugs, and a final round of harmonica tunes played by Buck. The same slow melody from that first week, the one no one recognized, but all had come to love. The nurse sat near the fire, her empty pie plate in her lap. It was the same one she'd used for months, slightly dented at the edge, one faint chip at the rim. She ran her fingers along it as if memorizing its shape. Then, when no one was watching, she placed it on the ground beside the fire, gently, like an offering. The next morning, the truck came, covered in canvas, creaking under the weight of new hope and old fears. The women climbed in slowly, some clinging to satchels of belongings, others empty-handed. The nurse carried nothing but a folded letter in her pocket, the one she had never sent. It said simply, "I'm alive. I ate pie. They were kind." As she reached the truck's edge, Buck nodded at her. He didn't speak, but his hand came up in a small wave. She returned it, eyes damp, lips pressed shut. Another guard, the young one with the notebook, handed her a slip of paper before she climbed in. A single word, written in careful block letters, home. She didn't cry until the truck was already moving, dust rising behind them, the camp fading into the flat Texas horizon. She looked back once, saw Mercy grazing near the fence, and thought of soap, of pie, of the word son whispered in a silent room. She had come to this place broken by war. She was leaving carrying something fragile, indescribable, not victory, not pride, but maybe, just maybe, humanity. The ship that carried them home cut through the Pacific like a slow heartbeat, its engines groaning under the weight of silence. The women stood on deck as Japan came into view. Not the Japan they remembered, but a gray shadow of it. Smoke still curled over distant hills. The ports were rubble, the docks warped and splintered, the sea around them littered with driftwood and ghosts. The nurse clutched the folded letter in her pocket, the pencil stub in her hand, and the napkin she had kept from the ranch, the one she had used to wipe pie crumbs from her mouth. It was white once. Now, like everything else, it was faded by time and touch. When she stepped onto the dock, the air felt heavier than she remembered, the scent of ashes, of sea salt, of something burnt but lingering. People moved like shadows, thin and silent, their clothes hanging from their bodies like remnants of another life. No one smiled, no one looked at them. The women had returned, but they were not welcomed as survivors. They were the ones who had surrendered, the ones who lived. The nurse walked through what was left of her hometown, the streets unrecognizable. The temple where she had prayed before leaving for the war was a skeleton of stone. Her family home was gone, a hollow outline of foundation and char. Her mother, she was told, had died in the firestorms the year before. A neighbor, an old man with missing teeth and eyes like fog, said it softly. "She waited for you, until the end." That night, the nurse slept on the floor of what used to be her childhood room. The roof was open to the stars. She could hear the wind slipping through the empty frames of windows. In the silence, she reached into her pocket and unfolded the napkin, spreading it flat beside her. On it were faint stains, cinnamon, maybe peach, maybe memory. She touched them with her fingertips as if they were words she could read. In the days that followed, she tried to tell people. She told a neighbor that the Americans had treated them with decency, that the guards were men who smiled, who taught them words like home and son, that they gave them food, real food, even dessert. But each time she spoke, the listeners turned away, their faces tightening like fists. One woman spat, "Lies!" Another said, "You have been brainwashed." One man whispered, "You should have died with honor." So she stopped talking. The story stayed locked inside her like breath trapped in the chest. She went about her days quietly, mending, cleaning, planting vegetables in the dirt that once held bodies. She no longer wrote letters. There was no one left to send them to. Yet every now and then, when the sky glowed orange at dusk, she thought of Texas, of open fields, of a horse named Mercy, of a cowboy tipping his hat and handing her a slice of pie, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Years passed. The war became a lesson in school books. The world moved on. But one night, decades later, as she sat by the hearth with her niece, a small girl with bright eyes and an endless stream of questions, she found herself speaking again. The child had asked what America was like. The nurse hesitated, then smiled faintly. "There were horses," she said, "and men with strange hats who played music on little silver boxes, and once," she paused, "they gave us dessert." The girl's eyes widened. "Did they really? Even though you were their enemy?" The nurse nodded slowly, her gaze drifting toward the window, where the moon hung pale and round above the ruins. "Yes," she whispered, "it tasted like freedom." And for the first time since the war, she felt no shame in saying it.